G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Minor Prophets. Tonight, I pray that it will be a benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So we're coming into the last session on the book of Zephaniah. We're looking at chapter 3, verses 9 to 20, and then we'll move on to Haggai. And our last session, we left off in chapter 3 with the judgment of Jerusalem. And why were they being judged? Well, because they were rebellious against the law of Moses. They were a very polluted city. The priests, they didn't obey the voice of the prophets. This is in time past, godly prophets, they refused to hear the voice of the prophets. They didn't receive any correction. They didn't learn from the previous disciplinary actions against themselves or other nations. And they didn't trust God, and they simply didn't worship God. There was no true worship of God. So Jerusalem, is in a pretty sorry state at this time. Her leaders were the ones who led her astray with their corruption, but her prophets in this time frame, not the godly prophets have gone before that they didn't listen to, but the ones who are in this time frame are false. And her priests also profaned the sanctuaries we saw. But in contrast to all of this, it says that Jehovah in the midst of her continues to be righteous. He's always righteous. When we saw that the destruction of the nations back in chapter 2 was meant to serve as a warning to Israel. And, having seen the destruction of the nations, did they learn anything? Did Israel learn? No, because they've become just as guilty as the Gentile nations. And in regard to these Gentile nations in the future, God tells the believing remnant to wait until he rises up in the final judgment, which is the tribulation judgment. And this will be after the second coming, where he dispenses. He dispenses with all the nations who are gathered against his people Israel, and he will destroy them. So this is part of his program to carry out the destruction of wickedness and the wicked ones. And this all happens in that tribulation period. Now, these things are signs that will mark Israel's restoration. And so we come into the book tonight, and where we're looking at the restoration of Israel, verses 9 to verse 20 of chapter 3. Now, we're looking at the conversion of the Gentiles in chapter 3, verses 9 to 10. And this is what Zephaniah says: "For then will I turn to the peoples of a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of Jehovah, to serve him with one consent. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my suppliants, even the daughter of my dispersed shall bring mine offering." So verses 9 and 10 of chapter 3 actually summarize the conversion of the Gentiles. In verse 9, there will be Gentiles who are saved. Now, these are the sheep Gentiles of Matthew 25, 31 to 46. Remember, this is in the time of the tribulation period. So he says, "For then will I turn to the peoples," which is plural, making them the Gentile nations. And these are the peoples, a pure language. Yeah, more literally in the Hebrew, it is their tongue, which is the nature of the object here. It's about their tongue. It's changed. Their tongue is changed from impure lips to pure lips. And the Hebrew word used here means to have a clear lip. The point is not only that their speech will be cleaned up so that it will become a pure speech, but the implication here is that there is also going to be just one language. And a point that Zechariah 14 will also make when we see him. Now, this one language that will be spoken throughout the kingdom period will be the language of Hebrew. And with this, they're going to be able to serve God, to serve him with one consent. And the reason for this is that they will call upon the name of Jehovah in the tribulation, and they too will be saved, and many Gentiles will come to saving faith. Remember, one of the purposes of the tribulation is to bring about a worldwide revival. And this is what we're going to be seeing in the tribulation with the Gentiles and with the remaining Jews. Verse 10, as a result of these sheep, Gentiles being saved, they're going to help in the regathering of the dispersed remnant. So the extent of the regathering, he says, will be so far away, it will even be beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, which from the viewpoint of Israel in those days was considered very far away. In those days, like viewing something on the end of the earth, so to speak. And he says that the Gentiles are even going to search out in those remote areas for Jews to bring Jews back. And Gentiles will bring God's suppliants, meaning Jews who have turned to God themselves. Even the daughter of my dispersed. So this is in that period of time when they're now being regathered in faith for preparation for the Messianic kingdom. So the Gentile nations will go and gather Jews from all parts of the world and bring them back into the land. The daughter of my dispersed refers to the Jewish people who are in the diaspora, in the dispersion, who have been scattered out of the land, Jews who live outside the land, and Jews will then be brought back as an offering to the Lord by these Gentiles, and Gentiles will be used by God in the restoration of Israel. So this is the regathering in faith. And now we see in verses 11 to 13, we see the regeneration of Israel. In that day shalt thou not be put to shame for all thy doings, wherein thou hast transgressed against me. For then I'll take away out of the midst of thee thy proudly exulting ones, and thou shalt no more be haughty in my holy mountain. But I'll leave in the midst of thee an afflicted and poor people, and they shall take refuge in the name of Jehovah. The remnant of Israel shall not do iniquity nor speak lies, neither shall a deceitful tongue be found in their mouth, for they shall feed and lie down, and none shall make them afraid. So this is to do with the regeneration and cleansing of Israel. And this deals with the removal of the sin and sinners from among Israel. Now, earlier he talked about the destruction of wickedness and wicked ones from among the Gentiles, but it'll also be true among the Jewish people. So he declares, in that day shalt thou not be put to shame. So what he's saying is, in that day they won't be put to shame for all their doings, wherein he says thou hast transgressed against me. And the reason is, for then I will take away out of the midst of thee the proudly exulting ones, and therefore thou shalt no more be haughty in my holy mountain. So he's going to remove the sinners from amongst these Jews which are remaining. And the whole picture here is that Israel in her sins has turned away from sin to God. And as a result, these sins have now been removed as already the sinners have themselves been removed. So this is now the nation that will come in faith. And in verse 12, he points out the saving of the remnant that will seek refuge in the Lord. I will leave in the midst of thee an afflicted and poor people. Now, this is a reference to the remnant. Now, Isaiah's favorite terminology for the remnant was the poor and the needy. And the poor and the needy in Isaiah is the poor and the afflicted ones of Zephaniah. So these are the ones he declares in verse 12 that will take refuge in the name of Jehovah. These will be the saved individuals. This is a remnant of Israel that will be saved. What did Jesus say he came to? He came to the poor and the needy in Israel, which he is talking about coming to the believing remnant in Israel. In verse 13, he spells out the results for the remnant. The remnant of Israel shall not sin, and they shall not do iniquity nor speak lies, neither shall a deceitful tongue be found in their mouth. So he points out that they will cease to be sinful, and they shall now be characterized by righteous living. And as a result, in verse 13, they'll finally gain security in the land. because he declares, for they shall feed and lie down, and none shall make them afraid. So at long last, finally, they shall be able to enjoy security living in the land that way. No fear of anyone attacking them anymore. Then verses 14 to 20, we see the regathering here. In verse 14, sing, O daughter of Zion, shout, O Israel. Be glad and rejoice with all the heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. Jehovah has taken away thy judgments. He has cast out thine enemy. The King of Israel, even Jehovah, is in the midst of thee. Thou shalt not fear evil anymore. Now, Zephaniah concludes his book in verses 14 to 20, dealing with the final regathering of Israel, because the restoration of Israel includes both the regathering, both the regeneration and the regathering. And he begins in verse 14, dealing with the rejoicing, and he declares Jerusalem to sing, sing, O daughter of Zion, shout, O Israel, be glad and rejoice with all the heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. So, whereas before for Jerusalem, it was all woe and lament, now for Jerusalem, they're to be happy. They are to be absolutely ecstatic with joy in their rejoicing, because they're finally in the land, in the kingdom, with Messiah as their king. And the reasons for their rejoicing we see in verses 15 to 17, and he gives 5 reasons for the rejoicing. First of all, we see in first part of verse 15, the judgment of Israel is removed. And then in second part of verse 15, her enemies are now to be cast out. And then in the third part of verse 15, Jehovah as the King of Israel is in the midst of her. So he will physically, visibly rule from the midst of Jerusalem, as we see in Jeremiah 3, 16 to 17, Jeremiah 3, 16 to 17. Now, who is that ruling in the midst of Israel? Well, that's the Messiah. In that day, it shall be said to Jerusalem, fear thou not, O Zion, let not thy hands be slack. So we see in the last part of verse 15 and 16, Israel's fear of her enemies is going to be removed. So he says, thou shalt not fear evil, and that's calamity, anymore. In that day it shall be said to Jerusalem, fear thou not. O Zion, let thy hands be slack. So this is slackness that comes out of an attitude of being filled with fear. So he's saying, no need to do those things anymore. In verse 17, Jehovah thy God is in the midst of thee. A mighty one will save. He will rejoice over thee with joy. He will rest in his love. He will joy over thee with singing. So God himself rejoices over Jerusalem, and this he spells out in the form of a rather detailed song. Jehovah thy God is in the midst of thee. He's a mighty one who will save. So he's going to save them both spiritually and physically. He will rejoice over thee with joy. He'll rest in his love, that is love for Jerusalem. And he will joy over thee with singing. And so for these 5 reasons, they are to rejoice. I will gather, verse 18 says, I will gather them that sorrow for the solemn assembly, who were of thee, to whom the burden upon her was a reproach. So in verses 18 to 20, he discusses the regathering proper. In verse 18, he states that the regathering of those who sorrow for the solemn assembly or festivals will be fulfilled. He declares, I will gather them that sorrow for the solemn assembly. The solemn assembly is a reference to the various festivities of Leviticus 23. Now, some of these will be observed again in the kingdom, and these are Pentecost, Passover, and Tabernacles. And because of the dispersion, now these have not been fully celebrated, and of course will not be properly celebrated during the course of the Great Tribulation either. So he declares here, who were of thee. So he again here reaffirms that Israel is God's people, and the burden upon her, Jerusalem, was earlier a reproach, but that was in the past. And now the reproach is going to be removed forever. Verse 19 says, behold, at that time, I will deal with them that afflict thee, and I will save that which is lame and gather that which was driven away. And I will make them a praise and a name whose shame has been in all the earth. Now, in this verse 19, the first part of verse 19, God is going to punish the afflictors. In the second part of verse 19, he's going to regather the afflicted. I will save that which is lame, I'll gather that which was driven away. So he's going to regather them first for the purpose to become a praise. And they'll be praised by the Gentile nations as they praise the Lord. And secondly, to become a name. This is going to be a name of honor in the Messianic kingdom. And in verse 19, he points out her shame has been in all the earth, but now that shame is going to be removed. Back in chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, he called upon them to regather as a nation that hath no shame. When they're really shameful, and now the shame will be fully removed in a spiritual way. And then, finally, in verse 20, we have God's promise to them. At that time, I will bring you in. At that time, I will gather you. I will make you a name and a praise among all the peoples of the earth. The timing is when I bring back your captivity before your eyes. And whereas in chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, Zephaniah spoke of the first worldwide regathering, the regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment, here he's dealing with the second worldwide regathering, the regathering in faith in preparation for blessing. And with that beautiful promise of Israel's final regathering, the prophet Zephaniah concludes his book. That's the end of Zephaniah. Now, in chronological sequence, we now move on to the next book, which is the book of Haggai. I've given you the outline there for the book. We see that there's going to be, in the first section is the first message, and in the second section we have the second message. The third section we have the third message. So it's broken up into those three sections. Okay. Chapter 1, verse 1, we have the introduction, the name Haggai in Hebrew, it came the word of Jehovah by Haggai the prophet unto Zerubbabel. So the name Haggai in Hebrew means the festive one. It comes from the same Hebrew word as festival comes. Now, about his family, there is nothing known. He doesn't mention a father, a grandfather, or any genealogy at all. Nothing at all is known about him. The date, well, he several times tells us that he prophesied in the second year of Darius. Now, in history, that Darius is known as Darius Hystaspes. And his second year was 520 BC. And so he prophesied in the year 520 BC. That was the year, but he did not prophesy the entire year. Based upon his own book, he prophesied only from the 6th until the 9th month. So basically, his entire prophetic ministry extended over a 3 or 4 month period between September and December of 520 BC. Now, Haggai was also a contemporary with the prophet Zechariah. And Haggai and Zechariah together were the prophets to the post-exilic people, those who came back from the exile, the Jews who returned to the land from Babylonian captivity. So Zechariah and Haggai were these two contemporaries. Where did he prophesy? Well, he prophesied in Jerusalem, as we'll see in the context of this book. The historical setting at this time, a remnant of the Jewish people had returned to the land from Babylonia. Once the Jews were given permission to return, only a minority of them returned. And these guys are referred to as the remnant. Now this is not the theological remnant, which is the believing remnant. This is simply a small portion of the nation of Israel who returned to the land. The way the word is used for the most part in this book is the remnant, in the sense of speaking of the minority who returned to the land from Babylon. Now, not all of them were necessarily believers in Jehovah. We also get a lot of the historical background from the book of Ezra. When the Jews returned to Babylonia, according to Ezra 3 verse 8, the building of the temple had begun. And in chapter 3 verse 10 of Ezra, the foundations of the temple had been laid and the foundations were completed. But according to Ezra 4:24, there was opposition at that point by the surrounding nations to the rebuilding of the temple. And so what happened was the rebuilding was actually stopped, and no rebuilding continued for a period of 15 years. 15 years. So the foundation was down for 15 years. But nothing was built on top of the foundation. Now, when Darius Hystaspes comes along, when he becomes the new emperor of the Medo-Persian Empire, he favored the completion of the building. So at least all the legal opposition and legal hindrances were now taken away. However, by this time, the people had lost heart and their zeal for rebuilding. So at that point, according to Ezra 5:1, God raised up two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, in order to encourage the people to proceed with the rebuilding. So Haggai, along with Zechariah, moves the people to complete the temple, and the people do respond. And actually in Ezra 6 verses 14 to 15, the temple was completed by the encouragement of this prophetic word from these two men. The major points of Haggai, well, we have two of them. First up, we have the divine origin of the prophetic message. So although the book is it's only 2 chapters long, with 15 verses in the first and 23 in the second, with a total of only 38 verses, nevertheless, what we're going to see is 20 times he happens to mention it is Jehovah who's speaking. So his first major point is the divine origin of this prophetic message. Now remember, when a prophet speaks, it is God who is speaking, because he's speaking the very words that God has given him to speak. The second major point he gives here is the danger of procrastination. And because the people procrastinate in rebuilding the temple, they suffer certain divine consequences that work out in their physical well-being. Now, in a New Testament quotation, he's only quoted once in the New Testament. Haggai 2:6 is quoted by Hebrews 12:26. The theme of Haggai is the rebuilding of the temple. So we have 4 sections. Each section, we have a distinctive prophetic message which is given to Haggai by God. We have the first message in verses 1 to 15 of chapter 1. We have the date and the call in 1 verse 1. In the second year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, in the first day of the month, came the word of Jehovah by Haggai, the prophet, unto Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, saying. So what he says in verse 1 is that the word of Jehovah came in the 2nd year of Darius the king. This was the year 520 BC. And when he says the 6th month, here he refers to the Jewish month known as Elul, and he came in the 1st day of the month. And the 1st day of each month is the new moon festival. So transposing that into the Gentile date, it is the 29th of August, 520 BC. And on that day, it says the word of Jehovah came on to Haggai, the prophet. So the Hebrew says here, it says that he came by the hand of Haggai. It says Hanavi the prophet, showing that he was officially a prophet. And a prophet like Haggai is someone who did receive direct revelation from God. Now, according to verse 1, this prophecy is addressed to 2 leaders, to the leaders, and 2 of them in particular. on to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. So Zerubbabel, who was the son of Shealtiel and the governor of Judah, he served as the governor under the Medo-Persian authority. Zerubbabel was a civil leader, but he was also a member of the royal house and part of the genealogy of Joseph, the stepfather of Jesus, which is mentioned in Matthew chapter 1. The name Zerubbabel means born in Babylon or seed of Babylon. Now, not that he was named after Babylonian gods, but it just points out that he himself was born in Babylon. He did have a more Babylonish name. Elsewhere we see in the scriptures he's known as Sheshbazzar. We see that in Ezra chapter 1 verse 8 and Ezra chapter 5 verse 14. And that was his name at Persian court. And the second leader was to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. So these messages are also addressed to Joshua, who, as the religious leader, was high priest at that time. The Joshua mentioned in this book here was the son of Jehozadak, and Jehozadak was also transported to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar 70 years earlier. Now, this is according to 1 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 15. We're also told here that he was the grandson of Sariah, who was killed by Nebuchadnezzar in the taking of Jerusalem in 587 BC. And according to 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 18 to 21, says the same thing. He was killed by Nebuchadnezzar. So Joshua's grandfather was killed by Nebuchadnezzar. His father was taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar, and Joshua himself was probably born in Babylon like Zerubbabel. Now, he and Zerubbabel are the leaders of the return from Babylon. And after giving the date, he starts it with words of rebuke now. We see the rebuke in verses 2 to 11. The sin we see in verses 2 to 6. Thus speaketh Jehovah of hosts, saying, this people say, it is not the time for us to come. It is nor is it the time for Jehovah's house to be built. This people say, this is a word of judgment. Jehovah, he's not saying, not my people, but he says this people. And the prophecy begins with a word of judgment here. It's a rebuke. And in those words of rebuke, he first spells out their sin and then the remedy for their sin. He says, this people, firstly, they say, it is not the time for us to come. This isn't the right time for us to gather together to do the work. We need to put it off a little bit longer. So God reveals their sin as the excuse the people are giving for not rebuilding the temple, because it's just not our time. It's inconvenient at this time. Now, their second excuse is, it is not yet time for the temple to be rebuilt. They are doing what even believers sometimes do when they know what the Bible says about a certain thing, but they do not want to do what it says. What they'll do is they'll excuse themselves on spiritual lines and say something like, we have not reached that stage yet. We do not feel led of the Lord to finish the work. Same thing that these guys are doing back in Haggai's day. The Jews were claiming that it was not the time for Jehovah's house to be built. But the Lord had already commanded that. So where there is a specific command of Scripture, there is no special leading necessary. The command was already there. The command itself is the leading. The command was to rebuild the temple. The Lord had commanded that the temple be rebuilt, and they're trying to get away from it by using these spiritual motifs, saying it was just not the right time. Well, that was simply an excuse. Then came the word of Jehovah by Haggai the prophet, saying, is it a time for you yourselves to dwell in your sealed houses while this house lieth waste? This is Jehovah's response in verses 3 to 4. Through Haggai the prophet, God spoke to their excuse. His question was, is it time for you to live in your sealed houses? And the Hebrew word for sealed means paneled. It was paneled, it was wood paneled. So sealed houses refers to houses that were paneled with expensive wood. Now, it's interesting to note that this is the same Hebrew word in connection, used in connection with the building of the first temple. And you can find it in 1 Kings 6, verse 9 and 15, and 1 Kings 7, verses 3 and 7. The only time it's not used of the temple elsewhere in the Old Testament is in the building of King Jehoiakim's palace in Jeremiah 22:14. So what's this all mean? Well, the fact that this word is used primarily in conjunction with the first temple shows that the wood that was intended to be used to rebuild the second temple 15 years earlier had now been taken by the people and used for the building of their private homes. Now, most homes in the Old Testament period were not sealed or paneled with wood because this was something only rich people could afford. Most houses were simply blocks of stone with some kind of plaster on the inside. Apparently, there was a lot of wood lying around the Temple Mount that was originally intended to be used to rebuild the temple. And since the temple was not going up, the people had taken this wood and they'd use it to make their own houses look much, much better. Now, while this house lies in waste, the Hebrew, it lies in ruins. And because of this, Haggai reminds them of the punishment in verses 5 to 6. Now, therefore, thus says Jehovah of hosts, consider your ways. You have sown much and you bring in little. You eat, but you have not enough. You drink, but you're not filled with drink. You clothe you, but there is none warm. And he that earneth wages to put into a bag with holes. So here he begins with an exhortation in verse 5. Now, therefore, thus says Jehovah of hosts, consider your ways. Consider your ways. The Hebrew literally means place your heart and meditate on this. Think on this carefully. Think on this with great consideration. Pay special attention to this. What he's saying is you need to look back at the last 15 years while the temple was not being rebuilt and consider carefully what had happened to you guys in the land. You've sown much and you bring in little. You eat, but you don't have enough. You drink, but you're not filled with the drink. So what he's saying here, verse 6, he's saying that there had been a lack of productiveness. You sowed much and you brought in little. Their land had not produced. Second, there was hunger. You eat, but you have not enough. Third, there was thirst. You drink, but you're not filled with the drink. You just don't have enough. Fourth, there had been a lack of clothing. You clothe, but there's none warm. You just don't have sufficient to keep you warm. And fifth, there had been insufficient wages to make their monthly payments. And he that earns wages to put into a bag with holes. Money was just disappearing. There was obviously widespread unemployment. Yet even those who did find employment did not make enough. And it was like putting their wages into a bag that has holes in it. And as soon as you put it away, it goes, it disappears, and there's nothing left to save. The punishment mentioned here is that which was prophesied would fall upon them for this type of disobedience in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 38 to 40. Deuteronomy 28, 38 to 40. So they sinned by living in nice panel homes while the temple lay in ruins. And because of this, they have suffered the consequences of unproductive land while living in poverty amid the niceties of their own home. Now, according to the Mosaic law, obedience brought prosperity. Today, people often use Mosaic law to teach that the doctrine that, God wants believers everywhere to prosper materially. However, one must not apply the Mosaic law in this case. Mosaic law was only given to the Jews, not to the church. And for the church, there's no guarantee of prosperity. one must be careful not to misapply the scriptures by taking promises given to a specific group of people for a certain period of time and applying them to another group of people at a different point of time. Can't do that. It needs to be taken in its context. Now, what's the remedy for this problem that they're having where everything is just disappearing? He gives us the remedy in verses 2 to 6. Haggai, now you issued a command in verses 7 to 8. Thus says Jehovah of hosts, consider your ways. Go up to the mountain and bring wood and build a house, and I will take pleasure in it, and I will be glorified, says Jehovah. So he gives a command here in verses 7 to 8. Thus says Jehovah of hosts. And in verse 7, he again tells them to consider their ways, and simply summarizing what they said previously, that they should consider carefully what's been going on in the last 15 years and consider the causes which have brought about their sin in failing to get the temple rebuilt. And in verse 8, what they need to do is to rebuild the temple. He tells them to go up to the mountains, the hill country of Judah, to bring wood and to build the house and to build the temple. Now, once the temple is finished, God will do two things. It says that he will take pleasure in it, so it'll be pleasing to the Lord. And second, he'll be glorified in it. It's going to bring glory to God in a way that he'll explain later in his book. In verse 9, he says, you looked for much, and lo, it came to little. And when you brought it home, I did blow upon it. Why, says Jehovah of hosts? Because of my house that lieth waste, while you run every man to his own house. Therefore, for your sake, the heavens withhold the dew, and the earth withhold its fruit. So in verses 9 to 11, he again reveals to them the punishment of the past. In verse 9, that which the land did produce was burned up. They looked for much, it always came to little. They were expecting a great crop, and they received very little. And when they brought it home, he did blow upon it. And whatever they did bring home was quickly spoiled and was not very filling. And the reason is, in dealing with the why, was because the temple laid waste while the people lived in nicely paneled houses. Because my house that lies waste, while you run every man to his own house. The people had completed their own homes. They were comfortable, while the house of God lay in ruins. And for this reason, the drought came in keeping with Deuteronomy 28, verse 24. Secondly, in verse 10, there's a lack of rain. Therefore, for your sake, the heavens were without their dew. The dew is what comes in the summer months and the dry season. The land is watered by heavy dew. And by this time, they didn't come, and so they failed to get their summer fruit, because summer fruit, like the vine crops of grapes, are grown by means of the dew, not by rain. And again, this is in keeping with Deuteronomy 28, 23. And then finally in verse 11, and I called for a drought. And a drought came upon everything, and he gives us the list upon what he called the drought on. It was upon the land, upon the mountains, upon the grain, upon the oil, upon that which the ground brings forth. It was upon men, upon cattle, upon all the labor of the hands. So in every area of their life, drought was being experienced, again in fulfillment of Deuteronomy 28, verse 51. And so he has spelled out the remedy, reminding them again of the punishment of the past. Their sin was the failure to finish the temple. Their punishment was a lack of productivity, and the remedy, get the temple finished. Now here we see the response. Now this was the first message that Haggai had to give the people. You're living in sin, you live in nice homes, but in poverty. And the reason for all this is because you have failed to finish rebuilding the temple. And because of that, the land has not produced, and what it did produce had been burned up because of a lack of rain. And due to the drought, you have not received sufficient wages. So here's a response of the people in verse 12. Then Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, with all the remnant of the people, obeyed the voice of Jehovah their God and the words of Haggai the prophet, as Jehovah their God had sent him. And the people did fear before Jehovah. So the first thing about the response is the people's obedience in verse 12. And he begins by focusing on the leaders. Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Both the civil and religious leaders responded. And then the people, the remnant that had returned to the land. The act that they did was they obeyed the voice of Jehovah their God. Second, they obeyed the words of Haggai, the prophet whom Jehovah their God had sent them. God did not speak audibly to the people. He spoke to Haggai, and the people believed the message of Haggai was the word of God. And the third thing is the people did fear Jehovah. Now, what's the response of God? In verses 13 to 14. In verse 13, we have the encouragement from God, which is, I am with you. That's basically it. Verse 13. Then spoke Haggai, Jehovah's messenger, in Jehovah's message unto the people, saying, I am with you, says Jehovah. And Jehovah stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and the spirit of all the remnant of the people. And they came and did work in the house of Jehovah of hosts, their God. So in verse 13, we have the encouragements. Then spoke Haggai, Jehovah's messenger, and Jehovah's message unto the people was, I'm with you. And that was a word of encouragement for them. In verse 14, we see the work itself is commenced, because Jehovah stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and the spirit of all the remnant of the people. And the result was twofold. First, the people came together, and second, they did work in the house of Jehovah of hosts, their God. So they began the reconstruction work of the building the temple upon the foundation that had been laid 15 years earlier. Now, the date when this was done, the first section now concludes with the date. It's in the 4th and 20th day of the month, in the 6th month, in the 2nd year of Darius the king. On the 24th day of the 6th month of Elul, and it was in the 2nd year of Darius the king, which made it 520 BC, putting all this together to the Gentile date, it corresponds to 20th September, 520 BC. So the people began the building merely 23 days after Haggai's message. Now, few prophets have had the joy of experiencing the kind of quick response from the people that Haggai did. And with that, the temple was now in the process of being rebuilt. Now, we're going to leave it here because the other section I want to do in one hit. So thank you for coming along, and study hard and grow strong.